everyone. I'm David Johnson, Transformative Consulting, and I'd like to give thanks to my dear friend and colleague, Cassandra Williams, who is the brains behind Educational Innovations 360 Degrees. Welcome to our live chat tonight. Our guest tonight is Divya Bheda. How are you, Divya?
I'm doing good. I love that music, by the way. It was very catchy.
Were you dancing by chance? Did you get up and dance?
I was bobbing, so I was like...
Well, tell us, where are you in the world?
I'm in the Bay Area in California, in the US.
Great. Well, let me give you a full introduction here. Divya Bheda, PhD of Bheda Consulting Services, is an education consultant with over 15 years experience leading professional development in brick and mortar and online learning contexts. Dr. Bheda is a leader in culturally relevant program evaluation, transformative outcomes assessments, and effective strategic planning for continuous improvement across departments, disciplines, and divisions. Her national and international workshops, panels, and keynote addresses focus on educational best practices to better serve students. She imbues social justice and is committed to building equity and organizational responsiveness for student success. As a people developer and organizational capacity builder in higher education, nonprofit, and ed tech spaces, she has facilitated, guided, and mentored others on the path to educational activism and meaningful change. She holds a PhD in critical and socio-cultural studies in education, an MS in educational leadership, and an MA in mass communication. Welcome, Divya. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Cassandra.
My goodness, you have an impressive background, such preparation. So now I've got to ask you some follow-up questions to all these things so that we fully understand the full capacity of your talents. Culturally relevant program evaluation. I have a sense of what that is, but perhaps you could better enlighten us all of what that entails.
No, thank you for asking that question. There's a whole field, culturally responsive program evaluation. It's just in the world of evaluation. And what we talk about is the idea that when we engage in any program evaluation, when we are saying, is this working or not, you have to take the context into account. You have to take the culture into account. And a lot of times, and given our history around the world, there are very white, Western, colonized paradigms that are imposed in whether something is successful or not. Or, in the nonprofit world, in the higher education world, does this model work just by replicating it from one part of the world to another part of the world? And it doesn't necessarily work, and it shouldn't be assessed and evaluated as being successful or not successful just based on replicating it. You have to take that culture into consideration. So that's
now, Divya, you used the term evaluation, and you did also at one point say assessment. So are you speaking about what we would otherwise call standardized tests, or are you speaking about curriculum and other aspects of assessment that would occur in higher education?
Great question again. Thank you for asking about the nuance. So program evaluation a lot of times is used in student affairs. Student affairs folks don't necessarily know it, but program evaluation is used in student affairs. It's also used in the nonprofit world, right? A lot of times when there are funders, when we want to do good work around the world, all around the world, we are using program evaluation. Assessment can be a multitude of things. It's a ubiquitous term that's used across the board, including in program evaluation. Assessment is in higher education. It can be testing. Assessment can be related to accreditation. Assessment can be, formative assessment that you do. Are students learning? Are they learning well? It could be a needs assessment or a climate survey that we do. So assessment is pretty ubiquitous. And I would say in all those spaces, we still have to be culturally responsive in how we ask questions, whether our tests are biased, whether the instrument is biased, whether who we seek data from, or the frameworks we use to seek data, are they biased? Are they subjective, which they all are? So then how do we make sure that they are culturally responsive? How do we make sure they are valid in what they're measuring. I think that's the key.
Mm-hmm.
So, good question. Thank you, David.
Could you speak a bit about what you have done and what you do, or even a definition of social justice? I consider myself a social justice advocate, and in close circles, I might even say social justice warrior. But how do you define social justice?
So for me, social justice is where we are trying our best. For me, it goes synonymously with reflexivity, where we are doing the best that we can to make sure that everyone has equal opportunity. So that speaks to, we are speaking to all elements of diversity, equity, inclusion, access, right? And we are addressing all these intersecting oppressive forces that are there as part of our lives. Whether it's patriarchy, whether it's nationalism, whether it's sexism, whether it is ableism, ageism. So we're looking at all of these isms that have an impact on how we live our lives and how we approach our world, and whether we can all thrive in it. So for me, social justice is working towards creating a world where we can all thrive and we can all start dismantling, recognizing those forces at play that make us unintentionally other or oppress each other, and create systems beyond
Now,
even interpersonal.
There's another term you have here in your bio that seems to be associated with social justice: educational activism and meaningful change. Would you expound upon those two terms?
Thank you. You get right to the meat of the matter, so I love this. so I find that in higher ed, we have, because higher ed, right? Like the history of higher ed is built on capitalism. It's built on, again, like white supremacy. It's built on colonization, right? Like Native people, especially in the US, when you think about the history of education, it's built on whitewashing history, on making, on assimilating everyone from different cultures and making them think that this is the cultured way of being, right? So when we think about the history of higher education, there are all these intersecting forces at play, right? And the impact of that is often either transferred oppression, where we engage in the same things that we have experienced that are traumatic, and we end up doing it to other, like our students or to each other, or it results in silencing or toxic spaces, toxic leadership, imposter syndrome, like this idea that you have to know it all, right? Like, so if you were to unpack, like, where does imposter syndrome come from? Or where does, why is there a culture of silence? Or why is there a culture of apathy? Or why do higher ed many professionals feel like they can't change anything? Or why is it that research is prioritized oftentimes in many universities as the money, as the bringer of, the thing that brings in money? And so it's prioritized over teaching. Service, where students should be mentored and students should be championed to be successful, that is not given the kind of remuneration, right? That another aspect of what your responsibilities are given. So when you think about all of that, what I would consider an educational activist, or who I would consider an educational activist, would be someone who's able to see all of that at play. Sometimes we also participate in it. Sometimes we are implicit in our perpetuation of these cycles of oppression. But someone who's constantly engaging in reflexivity and seeing, how can I make this better? How can I help not perpetuate this cycle?
Well, Divya, I hear us going into our conversation, which is titled Liberating for Equity in Higher Education. And we have here 6 talking points. So let's jump in. Where would you like to start?
I think I'd like to start with, definitions of student success. I think we start there. I think it's a great, jumping board. So a lot of times in higher ed, when we talk about student success, we talk about student learning. We talk about, are they able to, demonstrate written communication or my particular competencies in my discipline, right? We talk about time to graduation. Are we retaining our students? Are they graduating in 4 years or 6 years or how many ever years they're supposed to? We talk about debt incurred, right? So there are all those aspects. We talk about postgraduate career outcomes. But we don't talk about student success being about the student lived experience of their education. we all think, and that's where that transfer oppression that I was talking about earlier comes into play. We all think, oh, I slogged it out. Like if I've not met one person who has a PhD or who's gone through a master's program who didn't have one traumatic episode to recollect about how horrible the education, like a course or a faculty member or some interaction was, that still stays with them, right? So on some level, we are still trying to assimilate students and saying, you don't know how the system is. You better learn how to be in this system. Otherwise, you are not a professional or you are not a good student. And so part of that liberation is how do we move towards the student's success being about a strong, positive, lived experience for a student to help them have higher ed be a launchpad for their success, right? And to help them feel liberated and like they can thrive.
Now, Divya, you've touched on a topic which raises a question I have asked many times before.
Okay.
Whose responsibility is it to adjust? Is it the student's responsibility to adjust to higher education and the dominant culture in the United States? Or is it higher education's responsibility to adjust to the student and, of course, the dominant culture in the United States? Should the dominant culture change, in other words?
Right. So for me, I would say right now, at this point in time, I would say 70-30, 70% being the institution needing to change, 30% being the student needing to understand and change. So I don't even want to call it understand and change. I think that like the responsibility for student success lies equally with the students as with the institution. However, the systems, because there's not one way to be successful, right? And so if an institution, what I often find is an institution is not thinking about being responsive. An institution is not thinking about building capacity from the aspect of what is the student lived experience like. The fact that we have such a siloed higher education space where one office doesn't talk to another office, where one department doesn't talk to another department, where continuous improvement or change feels like, it's 10 years in the making, right? Because it's so slow is a problem. So when I think about whose responsibility is it for students to be successful, for me, it's the institution. That doesn't mean that the student is not accountable. Like it doesn't mean all or nothing. I don't think it's all or nothing. I think it's a collaborative task where they're actually partners rather than at each other. But institutions have to understand what students' needs are and be responsive to that. That's my philosophy. That's how I approach my work in consulting.
Divya, one of the terms you have in your talking points today is ways of being.
Yeah.
At one time, we spoke about attending college or attending university or even becoming a PhD as re-indoctrination. It is a form of doctrination. So in other words, your way of being would be altered. It would be modified. It would be changed. You will learn to think like a scientist. You would learn to think like a scholar. So again, whose responsibility is it to change?
I would say, again, the institution, right? Because what do we define as professionalism? What do we define as this model that we have, Maslow's model, which is your physiological needs, your safety and, affirmation, all of that. When you think about what he observed and who he observed, which is native tribes, right? Like that he went to the native population and then he said, please, can I observe you? And then he made up his theory observing them. When you look at that, they actually value the whole human being. So they say, when you come out, like we treasure you as a whole human being. Our job as a community is to help you, acculturate to our ways of being and help you carry traditions that are good for the well-being of all forward, right? As opposed to when we think about higher education, we are constantly saying, this is not professional. You are not a good fit for the institution. You need to submit things on time. So there is a lot of, and where does that come from? That comes from like a capitalistic assembly line efficiency model, which we don't, again, like we do not acknowledge all the invisible forces at play, right? Saying, oh my God, like I don't have the time to spend one more day to grade these students' papers because then I have to move on to the next task. Or I don't have time to sit and increase my office hours or be more flexible for my office hours because I have students who are commuting from very far away and they can only make it at this time, right? And so, or I have students who are caregivers. How much does a 12 credit hour, like, 12 threes or 12 fours are, 36, 48. Can students really do 48 hours worth of work for a 12 credit course? If you look at seat time, right? Can they really do that if they are caretakers, right? So the idea for me, I come from a philosophy, given my own lived experiences, there is a lot of room for institutions to change. And there are a lot of people within institutions who want change and, advocate for it.
All right, Divya, I'm going to jump to one of your other topics here. Again, starting with ways of being in higher education that perpetuate inequity. So are you suggesting, in fact, I believe this is what you said, that if the only way of being is to be like what your school or higher education is, it is inequitable. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I am.
Elaborate more on your definition of inequity.
So let me give you the easiest example that comes to mind. So a lot of times in higher education, in student affairs, right, we have offices that are offices for, the Office of Disability, the office, the Ombuds office. We have we have like groups which are Black Student Union or, international student groups or for student groups. A lot of times these offices are helping students learn the culture of higher ed, right? They are saying, this is what you need to be successful. Let me give you the tools that you need. Let me help you advocate for yourself. Let me help you navigate the system. But what if it were the other way around? What if these offices also were responsible for informing the university, saying, this system does not serve us. We need to have a universal design model. We need to have, like, this is the data. There are 150 students who are having issues with this policy because all my cases coming into the Ombuds office are with respect to this particular policy, or all these particular faculty members who are constantly unconsciously engaging in biased behavior or being outright racists or sexist, right? And so how about that data, rather than, yes, you are there to support the students, but who's taking care of the fire outside? You're putting the Band-Aid on the people who are injured, but who's taking care and making sure that the fire is mitigated outside? And so that's the analogy that I would use. I would go back again. I think institutions have the potential. I think individuals and institutions have the potential and commitment for social justice and change. I think there is a lot of transferred oppression, apathy, and that's oppression working really well. That is power, and that silencing of our liberation, that silencing of our power, of our activism, is the system working very well. So by us being quiet, we are perpetuating it.
Divya, I swear to you, we are hearing your education activism right now. So let's jump right to one of your talking points, activism for justice, liberation, and revolutionary ways of being.
Yeah.
Please, what do you define as activism?
So for me, it is that. Okay, so let me frame that, qualify that. So I have a framework for which I, that I offer folks usually, and I'll start with the framework and then I'll get to the activism bit. But the framework that I offer is that we need 4 anchors for us to engage in any kind of equity work or social justice activism work, which is that you are in the best way possible and engaging in reflexivity, saying, am I just being complacent? Am I participating in it? Am I perpetuating it? Or am I trying to resist it and create a better world? That we have the responsibility to constantly make things better. So with that activism, the framework that I offer is one where every space is a space that we can influence, where we can influence change, right? And advance justice, so to speak, advance equity. Each of those, we are all actors in those spaces. So those are arenas. We are actors in those spaces. And then we engage in certain actions or inactions that then can advance social justice or, mitigate it, right? And so for that, the 4 anchors are community, that we need to find community. We need to have a strong understanding of social justice. And I would go to Black feminist scholars. I constantly benefit. I have a group of wonderful colleagues from the evaluation world and wonderful colleagues from the assessment world. Some of them we call ourselves the mavens. There's another group who I constantly, they feed my soul, right? So that community is important. Having an understanding and keeping up to date with social justice, like when does something stop being helpful? When is it actually negatively impacting the work that we are doing, right? Because sometimes the same words can be co-opted and then used against the very thing that we're trying to achieve, because language is also part of the system, right? And so I would say social justice, community, prioritization. Again, the sense of time that we all work under is a capitalistic framework where we think time is money. Time is money. You know this, I know this, right? But how do we think about what impact do I want to have with time? And really, like, who is calling the shots about that time? And am I feeding into the capitalism aspects of, oh, there's no time for this. You don't have time to mentor a student. You have to write your research paper. Or how am I, resisting that? And then communication. How are we honoring the full human being in our communication as best as we can? And if we are not, if we make a mistake, I make a ton of mistakes. How do we learn to apologize and be restorative?
All right, Divya. I heard you say framework, and then of course you elaborated upon it and made it clear what you mean. So, was it 4 pieces to that framework?
Yes. So
and would you
4
just
anchors?
4 anchors. Okay. Would you just restate those anchors so that we have it clear in our minds?
Yes. Thank you, David. So it's community, social justice understanding, which means the scholarship behind it.
Okay.
Time and prioritization.
And time and prioritization go together.
Yep.
Okay.
And communication. So in each of those, if we keep those aspects at the center of what we do, with a reflexive lens constantly going through it, we will find that any action that we take, we can imbue it with social justice. We can find opportunities to build community that is there for us in need, community that is there to hold us accountable and correct our behaviors, right? We can find, again, like help with respect to rethinking time and our use of time. Is this the right way to be using our time? Are Band-Aids the solution, or should we be addressing the fire outside? And then communication in terms of, are we being restorative? Are we speaking in healing ways or in non-trauma inducing ways? Or are we engaging in transferred oppression where we are like, you don't know how bad I had it. You are not good in, you are not listening, or you need to do this. Like all PhD students or all master students do this. Like, who do you think you are? You need to address me in this way. All of that stuff.
So then those 4 pieces or those 4 anchors of your framework, if one were to implement those things or use those things or truly adhere to those things, they would be engaging in liberating for equity in higher education.
One would hope, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So, yeah.
I'm watching the clock, and we still have a lot of good stuff to touch here. So let me jump here. Engage higher ed in transformative change for liberation. What does that entail?
So for me, that comes back to the liberating for equity in higher education. So a lot of times when we think about equity, right, you've seen that picture where they have like 3 people. And one of them is like a young kid outside a baseball stadium or whatever, like, with a fence, right? And the problem with equity, even with the equity picture of that, is on some level, when I feel subconsciously, whenever we go around helping any community, right? So in higher ed, it's students, right? It's the students of color or the first generation students or the students from low income backgrounds or international, whoever that student group may be, or the students may be. Whenever we help someone, there is an immediate power imbalance, right? You would say, because you are helping someone, they are grateful, they kind of like feel grateful towards you. The minute we have that power imbalance, I feel like unconsciously, and this is my theorizing, right? I'm still in theorizing mode. I believe that unconsciously we engage in a kind of like a infantilism or a kind of like looking down on them. It's not conscious. It's not what we want to do, right? But whenever we are doing that for someone else, we are in a greater position of power. They are in a lesser position of power. And the minute we do that, automatically, unconsciously, inequity perpetuates because the power differential continues, right? And I'm not saying that we cannot help people. Yes, we need to help. Obviously, we need to help. But we need to then turn our lens. So yes, help the people, but turn our lens on what is it about the system that these people need help. So why we need to spend as many resources as we can on addressing the system as well, to say, hey, like, what is it about the way we are doing things that this group of students needs help, right? And so then when we address that and problematize that, right? So for example, even when we use the word language, right? When we say these students we have X students dropping out, or X students who are, there's an achievement gap between this group and the language that we use. Imagine if we said our institution pushed 20% of students out, and out of that 5% were international students or Black students or Latino students. We pushed them out. So when we think about the language that we use, the language oftentimes is very conducive to, again, holding the group responsible as opposed to the institution and the systems and the ways of being. So if we were to flip that around, and if we want transformation, part of what we need to be doing is looking at the system and saying, what about the system needs to change? Does that help?
Yes. And I tell you what, we have like 2 minutes remaining, and I want to get you on the question of equity. If you are an administrator or someone working in higher education, a higher education professional, and a student has an issue, a student needs help, you have power. You have power that the student does not have.
But Freire, like, so Paulo Freire, Brazilian scholar, activist, critical theorist, all of that, like, he talks about learned helplessness, right? So one of the impacts of oppression is learned helplessness, apathy, shame, learned helplessness, like all of that. And so the idea that I have to pick my battles, and so if I give in to this, then then maybe I will get that. Like, there are all of these, there's a lot of, like, again, that toxic environment of, where do I open my mouth? Do I stay in my lane? I don't want to get slapped on my wrist, right? Like, we hear all of these terms so often in higher education, so often, right? And it's learned helplessness. And so when I talk about liberating for equity in education, in higher ed, I'm talking about liberating ourselves. I'm talking about activism that we can, whether it's subversive, whether it's overt, whether it's silent, however it may be, we consciously choose, like, let's go back to activism time and time again. Let's look at, like, let's be reflexive. Let's look at what we need to parse out and how are we perpetuating the system. And
Divya, I could talk to you forever. You and I could go back and forth, and we join arms and being student activists. We could go on forever, but unfortunately, we don't have enough time to do all that. So if there were one thing that you wanted people to take away from this, what would it be?
That you are not alone. If you want to engage in activism, and if you want to create a better world, I think all of us as educators, on some level, we decided to be educators for that, that you are not alone, and that you just need to find your people, and then find that community, read up on social justice, learn about social justice, talk to people. I learn a lot from talking to people more than reading, right? So find your way of learning, learn, and keep at it. You're not alone. So,
and of course, you are a fountain of information. So if people want to contact you and learn more, or even want to use your consulting services, how shall they contact you?
Just email me. You can contact me on LinkedIn. It's just Divya Bheda. And then you can email me, divyabheda@gmail.com. So,
well, thank you for being our guest tonight. This was a stimulating conversation, and there's far, far more to say. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. I'm David Johnson from Transformative Consulting, and I'd like to give thanks once more to my dear friend and colleague, Cassandra Williams, who is the brains behind Educational Innovation 360 Degrees, and we are using her platform. So thank you, Cassandra. Thank you, Divya. Thank you all for being here with us tonight, and find us all on LinkedIn. Good night.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Bye, everybody.